Romans 9, let me see here. Number 22. We'll just put it on the screen here. Well, don't need to read the passage again. Thank you, Bruce, for reading that passage to us. But let's observe some things about this passage. First of all, there are several chosen ones mentioned in this passage. You have Abraham, you have Isaac, you have Jacob or Israel, Moses. And these were individuals and were chosen, Bruce, as individuals. Now we're not, and I said in my first speech the first night, didn't I, Mac? We don't deny corporate election. I don't believe one excludes the other. Didn't I say that the first night? What you're denying is you're saying it's only one way. God chose a corporate group, a class, but He didn't choose individuals. I'm saying they go hand in hand. That God chose the individuals and they form a class, and so therefore you cannot separate the one from the other. So I've never denied that there's a corporate group of elect people, but the question is, President Obama was individually chosen by the people, right? And he therefore became a member of the class or group of presidents, you see. So there is a group or class of presidents. I don't ever expect to get into that class, but anyway, there's a class or group of presidents, and how they get into that class or group is by being individually chosen. Once they're individually chosen, they become members of the class. I don't know whether I had a next chart on that, but let me continue on. He asked me the question. Well, actually, he said, does God damn people to hell unconditionally? Well, brother, what does the passage say? It says, before the children had done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand. Again, you may not like that. But see, it would be a violation of the passage for Bruce to get up and say, well, God hated Esau because of some evil he did. That's flying right in the face of what Paul's saying. Now, I understand you have a problem with it, and I have a problem with it too. That is, my depraved nature has a part to do with it. The flesh doesn't like that. But we ought to obey and believe God rather than what men say. So, Paul is saying, look, God loving Jacob was not because of any good thing Jacob did. How could it? It was before they were born. And God hating Esau, whatever is involved in that, whether it's temporal destruction, temporal loss, or whatever, it's still the reason why God treated Esau the way He did was not because of what Esau did. So you have a problem even if it's not eternal salvation, Bruce. You still have God being unfair in the eyes of the world that, well, you're treating Esau differently. Like in Malachi chapter 1, where God says, I'll show you, Israel, how I loved you and how I didn't love Esau and the Edomites. Look what I did to him. Look what I did to his descendants. I withheld these blessings from them. I cursed them. So here's the proof. So you still have a problem with the passage, even if it's not, even if we admit it's not talking about eternal salvation. Bruce, what I said in the debate with Pat Donahue was this. When Paul starts out in Romans chapter 9, and he says, I could wish that myself were accursed from Christ. For my brethren, that's Romans 10. He's talking about eternal salvation. When Paul says, I think here, will you put that passage back up there, chart 22, Basil? Chart 22, which gives the Romans 9 passage. When Paul says, not as though the Word of God has taken none effect. What Word of God is he talking about? He's talking about a specific Word of God, a specific word of promise. And notice how Word of God is connected with word of promise. So what was the word of promise? What was the Word of God to Abraham and to Sarah? That's the question. Not as though the Word of God has taken none effect. Obviously, Paul believed that the Word of God, what God's promised, is always going to be effectual. So he's denying that the Word of God can ever fail or not be effectual. When Paul says they are not all Israel, which are of Israel, is he talking about salvation there? In the 2nd chapter of the book of Romans, Paul says this, he is not a Jew which is one outwardly, but he is a Jew which is one inwardly. So I want to know, when he's talking about the true Israel of God, is he talking about salvation there? Okay, I think we are. We're talking about salvation. And you know, you could read that passage like this. They are not all truly elect who are of the elect nation. Right? They're not all Israel which are of Israel. The true Israel of God are those elected to salvation. Neither because they are the seed of Abraham are they all children. That is, children of the promise, children of God. But in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God. Again, is he talking about salvation there? About being the children of God? I say he's talking about salvation now. But the children of the promise are counted for the seed. Is he talking about salvation when he mentions being a child of promise? I think he is. For this is the word of promise. Notice word of promise is connecting back with the word of God. So it's the word of the promise of God. For this is the word of promise. At this time will I come and Sarah shall have a son. And we've talked about that. God had said the same thing in His eternal decree before the foundation of the world. At this certain time, I'm going to appear to the Apostle Paul on the Damascus road, and he's going to be born into the family of God. Sarah shall have a son. What kind of a son is Sarah going to have? By the choice and work of God alone. What kind of a child? A child of God, a child of promise. That's who's going to be born to Abraham and Sarah. And not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one, even by our father Isaac, for the children being not yet born, and notice how that's in parentheses as Paul is elaborating, explaining what he just said. For the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth. Now, Bruce, has he quit talking about eternal salvation there? Remember, I said what you do in going through that passage, this verse is talking about eternal salvation, and then when you see a verse in there that you don't seem to like, that's not talking about eternal salvation. But ladies and gentlemen, I want him to tell us, going down through here, where Paul leaves off talking about eternal salvation, and where he goes back into, to talking about earthly things. For the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil. Why is Paul saying, for the children not having done any good or evil, if it's not for the purpose of showing us that what those kids did, those boys did, had nothing to do with God's determination respecting them as to what they would become? If that's not the reason why he said that, then why is he saying that? That the purpose of God according to election. Election to what, Bruce? Election to be an ancestor of Christ? Is that what he's talking about now? He's not talking about salvation anymore? Or is he not talking about the same kind of election he had just talked about in Romans 8? When he said in Romans 8, who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? Is it the same kind of election he talks about in Romans 11? When he said there's a remnant according to the election of grace. Tell me, if that election that's squeezed in between Romans 8 and 11, it's not talking about the same kind of election. I say he's still talking about being chosen to salvation. Chosen to what? To become the child of promise or to become the child of God. So therefore, how could you, again, tell us, and like I said, we'll be discussing this next 2 nights, tell us where Paul drops off talking about eternal salvation. It was said unto her, the elder shall serve the younger, as it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. Why would we think about God loving a person got nothing to do with salvation? Further, on down in the passage, Paul talks about those who are like Isaac being vessels of mercy afore prepared unto glory. Well, when you talk about being prepared for glory, is that not salvation, Brother Mac? It's talking about salvation for sure. And then on down in the chapter, I think maybe verse 26, if my memory serves me correct, Paul says, even us, among the Gentiles, whom God has also chosen, like Isaac, even us whom He hath called. Is that dealing with salvation when Paul's summing that up, is what he's trying to illustrate? even us whom he hath called.